welcome to you. My name is Morley Wallace. There's only 4 of us in the group. We cover all of Ontario East, and it's a big territory to cover, but we seem to be handling it at the moment. GPS Ontario was established in 2000 as GPS Ontario. Before that, it was Morley's Custom Farming, and it was Morley's call him and he'll do it for you type deal. And then my accountant got a hold of me and said, you got to start splitting this all up. They can't have everything running through your farm. So we did. We created a name called GPS Ontario, and because that's basically what we did. Set it up as a one-stop shop for precision ag, and the reason for that was we didn't want people running to the John Deere dealer, to the Case dealer, to the AGCO dealer, to the Raven dealer, to the what have you, and having, just because it was cheaper to buy that particular item on the farm, that's what most farmers were basing their cost of where they spent their money. Problem was, none of those things were being compatible. So we were trying to take an IBM computer and match it to a PC and saying, can you do it? Yes, you can. Is it simple? No, it's not. So by having it as a one-stop shop, everything that you buy from us in the past has been compatible. We've proved it. We have the cabling. We know what cabling you need. We know the setup, configurations, programming to make it work. So we were an independent Trimble product sales dealer. And then since then, to complete the precision ag product line, we have also picked up another 17 additional products. So Surefire and as a system, and Deutsch connectors, and so we can build cables and what have you that's out there. So that's kind of a bit of a background in what we're doing, how we kind of put our company together. You as a farmer, I'm introducing you to a theory today of another possibility, another way of growing a crop. And it's theory, and if it works in your farming operation, great. If it's not a part of your farming operation, then okay, I hopefully haven't wasted anybody's time, but it's the theory. But in this whole process, you want to grow equal or more crop. You don't want to grow any less crop. You want your test weights to be equal or better. You want to spend or purchase less fertilizer. You want the crop to be full of the fences. That's a Eastern Ontario term. I don't know whether full of the fences means that the outside row of your field is just as tall as 8 row in. And when a lot of the fields that we see in Eastern Ontario anyways, we've been broadcasting fertilizer for the last 60 years. Well, broadcasting fertilizer only throws fertilizer 40 feet. We only throw fertilizer, that outside 20 feet only gets half the fertilizer. So you only feed the outside field for half, for the last 60 years with half the fertilizer, and soon you have gobbled up most of the nutrients that are in that outside area. So your outside row is 4 feet, the next one's 5, 6, 7, 9, and by the time you get in 8 rows or so, you're up to 12 feet tall corn. So we want to have the outside rows the same as the rest of the field. We want the crop to have even moisture over the whole field. We don't want one end of the field to be 22% moisture when we're combining, and the other end of the field 28. We want to have that crop growing evenly, coming out of the ground evenly, and so the moisture in the field being the same. We want to spend less time cropping, and we want to reduce the number of hours that we're spending in a tractor seat to put that crop in. As far as the farmers, what we're required to do is we're required to grow food for the public to keep them alive and keep them surviving. We need to grow enough food on top of that then for the husbandry industry, for the cattle, the beef, chickens, pigs, all these animals that we have running around, so that they grow up and then we have them for food for the public. We want the products that we grow to be healthy and nourishing, and we got the products that we grow to look healthy. Nobody will buy a rotten apple off the shelf. It has to be pretty and that sort of thing. We want to grow products then that are cheap. Different methods of cropping that we have been using in the past. Conventional tillage. Conventional tillage I consider to be where a farmer's gone in, he's cultivated, maybe he's disked, he's broadcasted fertilizer, he's gone back in, he's cultivated or disked, put that fertilizer into the top 2-3 inches of the soil, and then planted his crop. So if we look at this chart here, for an example, broadcasting fertilizer is basically getting that fertilizer on top of the ground and coming down 2 or 3 inches. Another option then is minimum till, where and then side dressing with with your corn planter. So we're getting a 3x3 or 2x2 band to the left or the right hand side of where we're placing the fertilizer. And then another option is a mole shank, where the fertilizer all goes to the bottom of the hole, and that's where the fertilizer sits. Now, the mole shank one is a viable option if you're growing potatoes, because you want your fertilizer down there, and then your potato spud goes into the ground, and that's where your fertilizer is, that's where it's growing. But when you're growing row crops like corn and soybean, that seed is getting planted about 2 inches into the soil. Well, if broadcast fertilizer, if it's being put into the soil and gets blended down, let's say 3 inches, there's 2 inches of fertilizer that is already above where the seed is going to germinate. You've lost a third. To me, you have lost a third of my fertilizer until that rain actually takes it down and percolates it into the soil. Innovative fertile stripping is the process that I have come up with for working with this. And what we're doing is we're taking a 5-inch deep by 6-inch wide strip, and we're working it up, and we're blowing fertilizer onto the ground prior to it being picked up and churned into a soil zone. And we're blending that fertilizer through that whole 5x6 strip. So when that seed gets planted 2 inches down and it sends out a root, it is instantly being fed by fertilizer. And regardless of where that root goes, that fertilizer is actually there to continue to feed that root. So what I say is that I'm feeding that plant from day 1, not day 10. And it takes about 10 days for that root to actually get over to that 3x3 band over here. And that's 10 days where it's not being fed by anything to make that plant grow. Is that important? Well, I think it is. Because if we start planting the end of April, 1st of May, and we plant for 4 or 5 days, and then it starts to rain, and it rains for 10 days before we get back onto the field, there's a big difference between what we planted in that first week and what we planted in that second and third week when you look at the crop growing. With conventional tillage, we don't realize that there's a delay in anything happening because we don't see that drastic a difference because that root hasn't got to that fertilizer. And so micromanaging the whole operation, I think this becomes an important factor. Anyways, moving right along. Innovative fertile stripping is the latest advanced, better management practice to be developed since the broadcast fertilizer spreader. We don't broadcast on our farm any fertilizer. Everything gets placed precisely in that strip, and we plant that fertilizer in that strip, And we do that in variable rate. We have the equipment that is set up so we can do variable rate planting of that fertilizer. And that variable rate program is considered a work order, and we pre-program that in the office and then send it out to the tractor and to the tractor cab. We use a TMX 2050 display, which is a Trimble display running center point VRS, which gives us about 1.5 inches repeatable accuracy. So we're running fairly close tolerances in our accuracy, and you'll see some pictures later on where we're going down the middle of that row between last year's crops and that kind of stuff, and that's what we're looking for. In that tractor cab too, we're going to have a Dawn monitor tablet controlling the strip till unit, down pressure, up pressure, and then we also have a GFX 1250 controlling the dry fertilizer volumes as they go into the out through the soil. And that's basically what the cab looks like. The 2050 display, the GFX display, and then the monitor running the other devices. Come on. My battery's getting dead on this or what? So what we're trying to do is create a perfect spot for that corn root to grow. Have it in well crumbled soil, light, fluffy, textured soil, and then 48 hours later, 24 to 48 hours later, we're back into that field and it's ready to plant. The seed bed is smooth and level, and the seed placement becomes perfect. A lot of planters out there, a 2020 system is providing heavy downforce pressure on the ground. And that got developed because people were doing minimum tillage. Well, it left the ground so lumpy and so crunchy that when the planter was going down the field, it was bouncing around. Well, you didn't get good seed placement. Some of the seed was within 1/2 inch of the ground, some of it was 3 inches down, and so then you got a very uneven yield or crop coming out of the ground. But that was the industry's way of dealing with it. With fertile stripping, that's a light, fluffy, 5 inches deep zone, and that planter rides right along there just as smooth as can be. It hardly shakes. So we've kind of changed how we have approached having seed placement. This is the Dawn strip till unit. So at the front here we have a slicing coulter. Right behind it is these two wheels here, which are trash cleaners. And then right here is the first coulter, lead coulter, that picks the soil up. And then on the other side of the unit is the other coulter that's picking the other side of it up. And down a tube right along here actually is where the fertilizer is going down the tube and being blown into and up against this blade, the back side of this blade. Everything rolls out through the back, hits these crumbling wheels, which have steel bars on them, and it breaks down that soil and makes the seed bed. This is another view, but looking straight on. So once again, it gives you the front lead coulter, the two wheels that are removing the trash, and then this is the tube here where the fertilizer comes down and hits just in behind the trash cleaners and in front of those roll blades. Everything is in milliseconds of time-wise, as far as being able to do the whole process. In the spring of 2020, we took over this piece of property. It's at the experimental farm in Ottawa, just off of Woodruff Avenue. We fertile stripped the whole field, and this field was soybean the year before by the previous farmer, and then we took over the field, and it's a sandy, loamy soil material that's in it. This is basically the same field. We're actually headed in the other direction. The difference between the two fields is, what I found interesting is this, and this is this fall, is how many seagulls we have now in that field. The previous field had no seagulls in it at all. That field was virtually dead as far as worm and biological growth was concerned. Now, 2 years later, because we haven't been working up this 24 inches in between the rows, we're allowing those worms to continue to reproduce from one year to the next. We're getting the microbial activity taking place. We're getting the reproduction of worms, and Mother Nature, through seagulls, is telling me I'm doing something right. I've got a pretty good crop production, reproduction working. So in the fall of 2022, which is this fall again, once we were done the whole field, as I say, you can see the seagulls doing their showing up and doing what they do best, steal my worms. And that's a field of corn that we did this fall. That was 285 bushel corn. That corn was approximately 13 feet tall, and there was a lot of trash. And we were worried that we weren't going to be able to take our equipment and deal with all that trash. And but obviously we did. So I just put that picture in there. This is the strip till unit, 8-row unit that we are using, and you can see that those row units basically are going right down the middle of last year's crop. So here's the old corn, and we're coming right down the middle, strip tilling this fall, and then next spring we will plant right on top of those rows. The reason that we're splitting the in between mainly is that those corn roots that are in that row from last year's crop are so big that they don't want to, when the equipment can't dig them up. So, so in 8 days after we have planted, we see about a 4 and 5 inch plant growing with a 5 to 7 inch root growth. That plant will grow a root that is full of that 6 inch trench. So it's a very robust, healthy root that we're growing. This is about 5 days after the plant has come out of the ground, and you can see that the root, that plant is growing its first set of roots here, but it's also started a secondary set of roots here. And that is what is actually gathering up extra nutrients out of that soil. So that becomes quite a robust plant when it starts to put all those nutrients into the actual stalk. That plant grows very quickly. That root is taking nothing out of that seed. That seed is still full and plump. So it hasn't used up any of the starch out of that seed to grow that stalk so far. Another picture of basically the fertile strip unit and what that would actually look like. Soybean growing down the middle of the corn row from, that was this spring, from one of the pictures that we had earlier just in the fall. But you can see how the germination is very even. And we're not getting 4 or 5 days in between having that germination of that seed coming out of the ground. This is a field of sorghum, so we're not just dealing with corn and soybean, but anything that we can grow in a 30-inch row, we're putting into 30-inch rows. We even have a little test plot this year where we grew wheat in 30-inch rows using this same method where we blew the seed into a 6-inch wide strip and left the 24 inches in between, not growing anything. Corn from this summer, and there's another picture basically just to show how evenly those plants are all growing. When you look at them, they all have 3 leaves basically on every one of those plants. Very evenly growing and reproducing. We went in and sprayed fungicide on the field of the corn, and that was the machine that we hired to come in and do that. That's the same field of corn as I showed at the very beginning, but just heading in the opposite direction. So all these barns and my property are back here behind us. That's the corn that we are producing on that field, and that's a big healthy cob of corn. When I take that cob of corn and split it in half, if we count it around, there's 20 kernels around on that cob of corn, and those kernels are extra deep in size. So my bushel weight in yield is better than it would be if they were shorter kernels. My neighbor grew the same corn as I did, and that's his corn compared to my corn right across the fence. Keeping the equipment running down the middle of the corn rows between crops, that type of thing. We have a product on our tractor called a protractor, and it actually will pick up with GPS where that planter is planting or where that unit is running, and it will adjust it to the left or right to make sure that we are planting in the middle of these rows. And then that picture is basically showing that the corn products, the corn stalks and what have you, there's very little of it left in this row between. It's basically the worms have gobbled it all up and made use of it. And that's basically a sign of healthy soil. So these worms, I want to touch on this for a couple seconds. The worms are lazy creatures. They prefer the light, fluffy, tilled soil, and they like to call it home. Worms harvest the cellular trash and digest it, and then they poop it in the fertile strip. They'll take it back, they go back to the fertile strip zone, and they poop it in there. And that's where my corn roots are. So unknowingly, I have the worms harvesting the cellulose, turning it into plant food and feeding my plants for me. And when we send soil samples away, we keep getting back a report saying, you've got healthy soil, but you've got one chemical in there that we can't identify. And I think we know what it is. Worms dig holes in the soil. Holes allow the air and oxygen to get to the roots. So we're getting aeration in our crops from the worms mingling in and digging in the soil. Those worms on top of the ground, they mingle with the second layer of worms, and the second layer of worms mingle with the third layer of worms. And my corn plant roots then find those air holes that the worms have created, and they will dig down, and those roots will follow those wormholes down into the deeper soil. And that becomes an important factor a little later on in the year. The holes work as a surface drain, and when we get a big rain, the water wants to lie on the surface, and it would be drowning out our crop. With the holes there, the soil, that surface water will drain down those holes and go down into that 3-foot, 4-foot range of soil, if you have that available to you. And when we hit a dry spell, and we have those tap roots all the way down to that 4-foot area, then my plants don't dry out, the leaves don't twist up, the plant doesn't retard back into a survival mode, and the crop continues to produce a healthy cob or beans, if it's soybean for an example. So I got a question for you. How do you reduce compaction for free? And the answer to that question is stop driving on it. People are finding that with big equipment, they're getting a lot of compaction. The compaction doesn't allow the roots to go down. The roots go down, and then they hit the compaction zone and they spread sideways. But they're not getting into that lower extremities of that soil. You want to get rid of compaction, stop driving on it. This innovative fertile stripping in 2 passes. First pass being, I work up the soil, I put in the fertilizer, I blend that fertilizer into that soil, and make a light, fluffy, moist, fertile, rich zone. The second pass is I plant. In 2 passes, I've got a crop growing, not 6 passes as I would have if it was conventional tillage. So that's kind of a silly question, but at the same time, it's a very simple answer. By only using 2 passes, this one being the first, you actually create these fertile strip ridges, and then the second pass allows you to plant. With this field, this was this fall, and you can see up here in the top corner, that field is all covered with birds. So it's a healthy piece of soil. Seed root that is showing kind of how rapidly that plant root is growing. And then, so there's as much root growing here as there is stock growing here. And that's what a lot of people don't realize is how fast those things are growing. Another picture of roots growing. The corn root on the one side, 2 soybean roots on the other. And you can see how robust those roots are. And all of these roots are growing, but that seed is still there. It's not taking the food out of the seed. This is a soybean plant in the early stages of growth, and in that early stages of growth you can see all the nematodes in there on that top set of roots, and this whole plant in the next 4 to 6 weeks will look exactly like that. But that's the early stages of that particular growth, and they're basically producing nitrogen for that plant. 2 corn roots, and you can see how robust the hairlets are. You got your primaries, you've got your secondaries, and then you've got all these little hairlets coming off of those secondaries, and there's what's picking up the food out of the ground. This picture is basically showing how the worms are how active the worms are. You can see up in here, these are the worm trenches here, and that particular group of worms has eaten all the cellulose in this area here. Another family of worms down here, and you can see how they've eaten and gathered up all the cellulose in this area. Same as over here. So we have a lot of activity of worms in that soil doing what it's doing best. This is another picture of some corn. In that particular field, when the combine went through, we were gathering 286 bushel of corn. 40 bushel makes a ton. 7 4s is 28, 280, so that's just a little over 7 ton of corn to the acre. That I don't need a calculator to figure out. I made some good money. Nitrous oxide emissions, N2O, also known as laughing gas. I will go through this very quickly. This is the Professor Tett from the University of Ottawa. He is running this test for us. Some of his equipment that he is working with, and a nitrous oxide tester is this unit here. That unit, basically, that scoop will come across, go over top of this pot, take a 10-second reading, and then it swings back again. And it does that once every 30 minutes, 24 hours a day. And in doing so, then it will actually pick up the sensors. This chart basically is showing broadcast fertilizer and how it's putting out nitrous oxide here. If we look at this over here, conventional broadcast is supposedly blue, but it's in purple here. but it shows when that fertilizer starts breaking down, and then all of a sudden, bang, we've got a huge amount of nitrous oxide being emitted, and it gradually breaks down. Right about here, we got another rain, so it spiked again, and it breaks down and comes across. The conventional strip till or side dress strip till program with a shank, basically, once again, it was a little slower at the beginning to react because that shank was putting that fertilizer down 3 to 4 inches into the ground. So it took a little longer for it to react, but once again, a lot of nitrous oxide escaping. The innovative fertile stripping is the green line, and you can see how little we are actually losing. So all this nitrous oxide that was escaping in this process is being bound up and caught by the soil in this process. And basically what's happening is every one of these particles of fertilizer is surrounded by 100 plus particles of soil. Soil is a sponge. Soil will actually gather up that nitrous oxide that is being emitted. For us, we believe that we can grow more with less. We can grow more crop with less fertilizer, and we get a better control over our cropping practices. And then I'll leave it at that. Any questions?
Have you experimented with the amount of, like, your rates?
Oh yeah.
Seed, like, you know, placing it with a seed 2x2 band. You know, I haven't seen much data on the maximum allowable rates. Have you been able to crank them up a bit higher?
For the fertilizer?
Yeah, for your 5x6 band.
Right now we're running about half the fertilizer.
As opposed to like a 2x2 band?
Yeah. Compared to a 2x2 band and broadcasting and then a 2x2 band, we're looking at there's some of the rates that we're running. Nitrogen at 133 compared to 190 for the conventional tillage, 65 for the P compared to 103, and the K was I'm not sure where that 23 came from. I think it's 123.5 for the K on that. We're running about 50% less fertilizer, regardless of how you put it on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Those are kind of some of the numbers. Field 11 is our 45-acre field, and it's one of the bigger fields that we get to crop. Field 6 is only about a 6-acre field. But this one here, we do a lot of unique little testing in the field as well. But that happened to be the total final numbers that we actually put on for the cropping. And then in doing so, we're, as I say, are you looking at a 14 kernel round cob, 35 kernel long, or are you looking at an 18 or a 20 kernel long cob, 45 kernel long? And really, it's just a matter of how we're feeding it. We're using half the fertilizer, and we're overfeeding the crop by almost 100%, because we're only using a fifth of the soil out of that 30 inches. So cutting it in half and then still puts 2/5 of that broadcast supposedly in that trench. But one of the keys to the program is not having a rope or a sausage run of fertilizer for that root to come and find. Having the fertilizer surrounded by soil then eliminates any chance of burning. and we can get away with some fairly high numbers. We did a field for a farmer this fall where he put 450 pounds of P and K into that trench. And he says, Morley, you said it isn't going to burn, so we're going to try it. And we said, you're spending an awful lot of money. Like that's like putting 3 tons of fertilizer in that trench equivalent. So it's one of those things where it is trial and error. I am presenting a theory, you know, but the theory works. It works very well for us.
In your emission chart there and so forth, since you're putting the fertilizer on in the fall and so forth,
Yes.
all the gassing off and so forth starts basically from day one, and by the time you came in there, I believe it started showing that day 60 or day 80. I couldn't really tell if it was a 6 or an 8.
Yep.
And that's when all the spring fertilizer was put on, where it actually, yours is already totally gassed off or whatever and stabilized within the soil matter, where the new stuff is basically now just starting their process there and so forth. So how do you explain that?
Okay, so nitrous oxide, is this nitrous oxide? This is for the nitrous oxide that you're talking about, right? Nitrous oxide is only created from the urea and the nitrogen. It doesn't come from the phosphorus and potash.
Correct, but you do have, you know, your nitrogen in yours, but it's already gassed off since it was 60 days prior to when that was started.
Yeah, there's only about 3 points of nitrogen in that fall application of phosphorus and potash.
So do you use any foliar program?
At the moment, no. We don't. That's something that's on the charts to be done. We only change one item per year, because if we change 2 or 3 of them, then we don't know which one has helped and which one has hurt or whatever that way. Foliars, last year and this year was the first years that we actually did slow release nitrogens and worked through the process of that. We do side dress 28 and 32% on corn in June type thing, middle of June. And that gives us a bit of a spike then on the nitrous oxide as the charts, if I went back to them, it would show. But other than that, no, the foliars at the moment we haven't done any work on that yet. We've got companies that want to, give us the product and say, hey, can you do some testing on it? But we're still trying to establish how little fertilizer we can get away with and still grow a crop. We overdid strips, 24-row strips, where we had like 350 pounds of phosphorus and potash going on, where typically I only put about 125 to 135 on. So it makes, and it did absolutely nothing to our yield. There was no increase in that. Yeah.
Right there.